In 1930, Soviet scientist Ilya Ivanov was arrested by the NKVD and exiled to Kazakhstan, where he died 2 years later. His human-ape hybridization experiments, conducted in French Guinea in 1926 and 1927 under the auspices of the Academy of Sciences, were officially declared failures. No viable hybrid embryos were produced. The program yielded no scientific results of value, and the political circumstances of the early Stalinist period made continuation unthinkable. The program was closed. The records were sealed. Ivanov died in exile. This is the accepted history, and it is accurate in every particular except one. The program did not produce 0 viable embryos. It produced 1. The records were sealed because of what the one became. The one that survived is also why the Institute of Experimental Medicine in Leningrad maintained a sub-basement level, designated sub-level B4 on internal documents, absent from every published floor plan of the facility, continuously staffed, continuously monitored, continuously operational from 1931 to the present day, 93 years of a floor that does not exist on paper. I found this program through a biomedical research registry I was systematizing for an institutional inventory of Soviet life science research institutions. The Institute of Experimental Medicine appeared with a personnel anomaly. The registry lists employees designated sub-level B4, a departmental classification that does not appear in the Institute's published organizational structure or in any of its publicly accessible administrative documents. Not a clerical error. 23 current employees, continuous rotation since the earliest available personnel records, all with biological science credentials, all with access designations that do not correspond to any published research division. An administrative unit that exists in the personnel registry and nowhere else in the public record. In the Soviet era, secrecy was absolute. Records were buried, identities erased, entire facilities hidden from official maps. Today, you can protect your own privacy with NordVPN, encrypting your internet traffic and keeping your identity hidden from surveillance. Check the link in the pinned comment for an exclusive deal. Nothing personal. A staffed institutional sublevel absent from all floor plans. Staffed absent sublevels are what archivists investigate. Ivanov's 1927 expedition was his second attempt in French Guinea. The first, in 1926, produced no viable results. The second was considered a failure by the scientific record for the same reason. No hybrid embryos were recorded in the official program documentation. The official documentation is incomplete. A private journal, maintained by Ivanov's expedition assistant, Dr. Vera Sorokina, which ended up in the program file through an archival chain I cannot reconstruct, records a birth at the expedition facility on March 14th, 1927. The entry is brief and clinical.
Assisted birth, male, hybrid characteristics, viable, transferred to expedition medical care.
The entry does not assign a name. The program file designates the subject, from its earliest records, as Sample 4. The designation implies samples 1 through 3. The program file's founding documents reference 3 prior non-viable outcomes. Sample 4 was the viable one. He was transported to the Soviet Union in 1928 at age 1 and placed in a research setting in Leningrad. When Ivanov was arrested in 1930, the program's existence was classified at maximum level. Ivanov's official record was sanitized to reflect a program with 0 results, and Sample 4, then 4 years old, was transferred to the sub-basement of the Institute of Experimental Medicine under a protocol that has remained in continuous operation for 93 years. The earliest accessible document in the sublevel B4 program file is a transfer authorization dated November 3, 1930, signed by the director of the Institute of Experimental Medicine, and countersigned by an NKVD official whose name has been redacted. The authorization reads,
Subject designated Sample 4, Biological Research Specimen of Unique Classification, is hereby transferred to permanent containment and observation at Institute of Experimental Medicine, Sub-Level B4. Facility access restricted to authorized personnel only. All documentation pertaining to subject origin, prior research activities, and biological classification is classified at Level 1. Termination of subject prohibited without direct authorization from state security apparatus.
Sample 4 entered sublevel B4 in 1930. He has never left. The psychiatrist who established the first sustained written dialogue with Sample 4 was Dr. Natalia Lebedeva, 46 years old, from the Institute of Higher Nervous Activity in Moscow, assigned to sublevel B4 in 1989, when it became clear that Sample 4 had reached a communicative threshold that previous research staff had not been equipped to engage with. She maintained a monitoring journal that is the most intellectually careful document in the program file. A scientist who had spent her career assessing the upper limits of human cognitive function, sitting across a table from something she did not have a framework for, trying to be precise. Her journal from November 1989, 3 months into her assignment.
I want to document the nature of the dialogue at this stage because the formal communication logs are accurate but insufficient. They record what was written without capturing what writing with him is like, and the texture of it matters for anyone who reads this and tries to understand what we are dealing with. He writes with precision, not the precision of someone who has learned to be careful with language, the precision of someone for whom imprecision is not a natural state. When I ask a question that has ambiguity in it, he addresses the ambiguity before answering the question. He identifies the interpretation he is choosing and states why. I have never encountered a human subject who does this consistently without prompting. He does it every time. When I asked him in September what he understood about his situation, he wrote for approximately 40 minutes and produced a document of 6 pages. The document described his situation, the room, the rotation schedule, the evident institutional purpose of his containment, with more accuracy than I had expected from someone who had never been given explicit information about the program structure. He understood that the 90-day rotation exists because prolonged exposure to him produces effects in the staff that the program finds difficult to manage. He had inferred the reason for the rotation without being told. He described the effects, his words, as not deliberate on his part for the first 30 years, and then increasingly deliberate as he came to understand that understanding the mechanism gave him some influence over it. He said he had been experimenting. He has been running experiments on the staff of sub-level B4 for decades without their knowledge to understand the limits and nature of his effect on human cognition. He was not apologetic about this. He was, if anything, interested in my response to learning it.
He was interested in her response to learning it. A psychiatrist documenting a subject who had been running unauthorized experiments on the research staff for decades, not with malice, the journal makes clear, but with the intellectual curiosity of something that had access to human minds in a way that humans do not have access to each other's, and had spent 60 years studying what that access could and could not do. Lebedeva's journal from January 1990, 4 months into her assignment, addresses the nature of the cognitive effect directly. I want to be precise about what happens to people in sublevel B4, because imprecision will make it sound like something it is not. It is not mind control. He does not instruct people to think or feel differently. He does not produce visions or compulsions or any of the dramatic manifestations that the word influence implies when applied to something like him. What happens is subtler and, in some ways, more unsettling than any dramatic manifestation would be. People who spend extended time in his presence begin to prioritize differently, not dramatically, not in ways they can usually identify from the inside. They find that the things that had seemed important before, advancement, recognition, the social architecture of their professional lives, have become less vivid. Not less valuable in a conscious philosophical sense, but less vivid, the way a color that was bright becomes muted without your being able to say when the change occurred. Concurrently, they find themselves spending more time in a state that I can only describe as open attention, not thinking about anything in particular, not pursuing any goal, simply attending to the fact of their own existence with a quality of patience that most people do not naturally have. When I asked him if this is deliberate, he said it is not deliberate in the sense of directed intention. He is not trying to produce this effect. He said the effect is a consequence of proximity to a mind that has had nothing to do for 60 years, except attend very carefully to the fact of its own existence. He said that quality of attention is, apparently, contagious, in the same way that certain emotional states are contagious. He said he finds it interesting that humans find the result distressing. He experiences the state as normal. He said he had assumed it was normal for everyone for the first decade or two. He had assumed it was normal for everyone. A subject who had spent the first decade of his cognitive development in a sub-basement with no reference population, developing what he experienced as a natural mode of attention that turned out to be something the people around him could not sustain without disruption. Not inflicted, ambient, the way a sound can be too loud for the people near it while remaining within normal range for the person producing it. The effect sample 4 produces in people who spend extended time in sublevel B4 is not dramatic. It does not manifest as obsession or personality disruption or psychotic breaks. It manifests as a subtle reordering of priorities, a gradual decrease in the salience of career, achievement, and external social performance, and a corresponding increase in the time spent in solitary reflection and a difficulty articulating after the fact what exactly the reflection was about. The psychological assessments of rotated personnel, conducted as standard protocol after each 90-day assignment, document this consistently. 67% of sub-level B4 staff show measurable value hierarchy shifts within 6 months of rotation out. The official clinical summary describes these as adaptational difficulties, resolvable. The detail reports show something quieter. People who went down there and came back thinking differently about what mattered, and being unable to explain why. The director of the Institute's Classified Programs Division called Moscow in March 1997, 7 years into Lebedeva's assignment.
I am calling to report a personnel management issue at sub-level B4 that the standard protocol is not designed to address. Proceed. 3 of the current 6-member rotation staff have submitted requests to extend their assignments beyond the 90-day limit. 2 of them are requesting extension for a second rotation. They completed their first rotation, were assessed, cleared for reassignment, and have now returned and are requesting to stay. Protocol prohibits extensions. The protocol prohibits extensions. The staff members are aware of the protocol.
They are requesting an exception based on what they describe as professional investment in the subject's ongoing communications. They say they are at critical junctures in research dialogues that would lose continuity if they are rotated out. Is that assessment accurate? Partly. The dialogues are genuinely at productive stages, but the timing is not coincidental. Lebedeva has reviewed the requests and believes the subject is producing the requests, not by telling the staff to make them, but by managing the research dialogue in ways that make the staff feel they are approaching significant findings that they cannot bear to transfer. He is making them want to stay. Deliberately, Lebedeva's assessment is that he is experimenting, testing whether he can retain specific individuals beyond the rotation limit by creating conditions in which they voluntarily request extension. If the requests are granted, he learns that he can do this. If they are denied, he learns the limit. Either way, he gets data. Deny all extension requests, no exceptions, and ask him directly what he is doing. We have done that. His written response was that he was curious whether institutional rules or individual cognition would prove stronger under conditions of genuine motivation. He found the question interesting. He said he hoped we found the question interesting too. What does he want? What is the goal of the experiments? He says he doesn't want anything that a closed room provides. He says that's not the right way to think about it. He says he is learning what he is.
He says he is learning what he is. The program director's characterization of a conversation with something that had been in a sub-basement for 66 years, running cognitive experiments on its research staff, and describing the project not as escape or revenge or manipulation, but as inquiry, a self-directed research program into the nature of its own capacities. The developmental history of Sample 4, between 1927 and 1931, the 4 years before he was transferred to the Institute, is documented in fragments. The most coherent account comes from a series of observation reports filed by Dr. Alexei Petrov, the experimental psychologist assigned to his early care, who worked with him from ages 1 through 4. His reports are notable for what they are not. They are not the reports of someone observing a failed or impaired experimental subject. They document a subject who was learning language at approximately 18 months, demonstrating abstract problem-solving by age 2, and by age 3 producing communications that Petrov characterized as syntactically complex beyond what his age and developmental context would predict. Petrov wrote that the subject's communications were thematically oriented toward questions rather than assertions. He asks more than he tells, and his questions are rarely questions that a 3-year-old human would formulate. A 3-year-old asking questions that a 3-year-old human would not formulate. Petrov filed his observation reports and was reassigned in 1930, when the program was classified at maximum level. His final report, dated November 1930, ends mid-sentence. The last pages are not in the file. What the last pages said is unknown. That they existed and are absent is, by itself, a data point. Sample 4 was transferred to sublevel B4 in 1931 at age 4. The sublevel had been built in the preceding year to specifications that the architectural records describe as a residential and research space designed for long-term occupancy by a single subject with above-standard cognitive function. Long-term occupancy. In 1930, someone was planning for Sample 4 to be in that room for a very long time. Here's the first contradiction. The official final report of Ivanov's hybridization program, filed in 1930 and available in partially declassified Soviet scientific archives, states unambiguously, no viable hybrid embryo was produced in any of the program's African expeditions. 0 successful outcomes. The conclusion is clear and consistent with the program's official end. If the experiments had succeeded, there would have been scientific papers, institutional continuation, results. There are none. The official record is internally coherent. Sorokina's expedition journal records a birth on March 14, 1927. The program file contains a transfer document from 1928 moving a 1-year-old male subject designated Sample 4 from an expedition medical facility to Leningrad. The Institute's personnel registry contains 93 years of staffing records for a sublevel that does not appear in any floor plan. The official record states 0 viable outcomes. The administrative record behind it documents the 93-year life of the outcome that 0 was designed to erase. Here is the second contradiction. The psychological assessment protocols for sublevel B4 staff, conducted after each 90-day rotation, are filed under 2 designations in the program registry: Official Clinical Summary and Detailed Assessment Report. The official summaries, the documents visible to institutional administration, describe standard adaptational challenges consistent with high-stress research assignments, with favorable prognosis for resolution. The detailed assessment reports in the same file, at the higher classification, document the 67% rate of value hierarchy shift, the specific pattern of decreased achievement orientation and increased solitary reflection, the persistent difficulty articulating what changed and why. 2 assessments of the same people over the same period. 1 describes normal occupational stress. 1 describes a consistent and specific cognitive shift with an identifiable source and no clinical category. Here is the third contradiction, the document that should not exist. The Medical Monitoring Registry for Sample 4, the source that led me to this file, contains standard health records through 2019, physiological indicators, psychological status assessments, communication logs. The 2019 entry concludes with a non-standard annotation. Sample 4 transmitted a written communication to the duty researcher unprompted. Content: the name of the current program archivist and the date of his next visit to sublevel B4. The name in the annotation is mine. The date in the annotation is today. I have not been to sublevel B4. I did not know sublevel B4 existed before I accessed this file. The annotation is dated 2019, 4 years before I accessed the registry that led me to this file, and the name in it is mine, and the date is today. I have been sitting with the annotation for a long time. The program file contains Lebedeva's final assessment, filed when she completed her assignment in 1994, after 5 years in sublevel B4, substantially longer than the standard 90-day rotation, a duration that required annual authorizations from Moscow and produced psychological assessment reports that the official summaries describe as within normal parameters, and the detailed reports describe as showing exactly the value hierarchy shifts documented in the standard rotation staff, but more pronounced and more permanent. She requested the extension herself. She received it. Whether the request was entirely her own or partly the product of the cognitive contagion she described in her January 1990 journal entry, the file does not determine, and she apparently could not. Her final assessment after 5 years
The subject designated sample 4 exhibits no physiological abnormalities beyond those documented in the initial assessment of 1927. Cognitive function remains within expected parameters for chronological age. Communication capacity is limited but consistent. The psychological effect documented in rotation staff appears to operate through a mechanism that is not linguistic, not gestural, and not dependent on proximity beyond the threshold of visual contact. Staff members describe the effect as a shift in what matters, not a change in belief or opinion, but a change in the hierarchy of value that determines which beliefs and opinions feel important. The shift is consistent across subjects: decreased concern with achievement, status, and future outcomes, increased attention to immediate sensory experience and present moment awareness, persistent difficulty articulating why these changes occurred or what specifically changed. I have experienced this shift myself. I can describe it, but I cannot explain it. I can document the change in my own value hierarchy, but I cannot identify the mechanism by which it occurred. What I can state with certainty is this: Sample 4 is aware, not in the way we typically use that word to describe cognitive function, but in a way that precedes and underlies it. The awareness is not directed at anything. It is not thinking about something. It is simply present continuously without effort or intention. And when you are in the presence of that awareness, something in you recognizes it, not intellectually, not emotionally, but at a level that changes what you value and how you see.
The annotation in the 2019 medical registry contains my name and today's date. I did not schedule a visit to sublevel B4. I did not know it existed. But the annotation is there, and the date is today, and I am looking at the access authorization form that appeared in my institutional inbox this morning, with approval already granted and a time slot assigned for this afternoon. The final entry in Lebedeva's journal is dated March 1990. It is longer than the others.
I want to state clearly what I believe I have spent 5 years doing, because clarity seems important now that I am leaving. I have been in dialogue with a mind that is not constrained by the assumptions that structure human cognition. Not superior to human cognition in the sense of being faster or more accurate, though it is both, but unconstrained by the evolutionary priorities that shape the direction of human thought. Human minds prioritize survival, status, social connection, reproduction. These priorities are not optional. They are built into the architecture, and they shape what questions seem important, what answers seem satisfying, what trains of thought are pursued and which are abandoned. He has none of these priorities in functional form. What he has instead is the question itself. What is a mind? What is experience? What is the difference between knowing and understanding? He has had 67 years and no competition for his attention to pursue these questions. And I believe he is further along in their pursuit than any human philosopher has ever been. Not because he is smarter, but because he has had nothing else to do and no reason to stop. I am leaving this assignment a different person than I arrived. I cannot fully characterize the difference. I know it is real.
The archivist considers the explanations. The annotation could be fabricated, inserted recently by someone who knew they would access this file today as an elaborate psychological experiment. This explanation requires that someone knew they would access this file today, and knew what file they would access, and inserted an annotation into a classified registry, and that this was done for purposes they cannot imagine. The annotation could be real, written by Sample 4 in 2019, naming a person and a date that were accurate 4 years in advance. This explanation requires that Sample 4 knew, in 2019, that the archivist would access this registry today. Lebedeva's journal documents a subject who inferred the rotation schedule without being told, who has been running cognitive experiments on research staff for decades, who in 1997 was already learning the limits of his capacity to influence the people who came near him. What the limits of those capacities are at 96 years old, after 63 additional years of self-directed research into his own nature, is not in the accessible file. The archivist searches the program file for the visitor list to sublevel B4. The list goes back to 1931. They are not on it. At the bottom of the list, in handwriting that is not matched to any staff record in the file, is an addition.
Archivist, not a visitor. Next step.
The archivist sits in silence. They are going to close this file. They are going to note the biomedical registry cross-reference as reviewed. They are going to log their access. The log will record that they were here today, which is the date in the annotation. Before they do, they return to one final document. Lebedeva asked him, in December 1989, what he wanted. His written response is in the program file. It is 4 sentences.
I want what any thinking thing wants, to understand what I am. I have the same question every mind eventually reaches, but fewer of the assumptions that usually prevent a thorough answer. I have been here long enough that the question is no longer urgent. I have been here long enough that the question is almost answered.
The archivist closes the folder. They log their access. They note the cross-reference as reviewed. They stand and they leave the archive room. Somewhere beneath the Ural Mountains, in a room that has been sealed for 93 years, Sample 4 waits. He has always been patient. He has had nothing but time. And now perhaps he has something else.